We've all heard of the American Civil War and the French Revolution. The Cold War and Cuba are old hat by now, and we've seen so much on Iraq and Afghanistan we know them inside out. These parts of history may indeed be pretty crazy, but they're so well known they just don't have the same impact anymore. But do you know about the world's craziest Central Asian dictators, who spend millions building marble palaces or boil their political opponents to death, depending on which country you look at? So in today's video, we are going to go over the top 10 countries with insane histories. Number 10. The Gambia. The fact that the first Gambian president was re-elected 5 times and the second ruled for over 2 decades, for a total of 53 years between them, should tell us volumes about the politics and history of this country. Dada Jawara, the country's first leader, took up his post initially as Prime Minister in 1962, just before Gambian independence from the UK. Jawara was, by all accounts, somewhat better than other African leaders of the era. Corruption in the Gambia was less prevalent than in other neighboring countries. The majority of senior governmental figures led relatively modest lives, at least compared to, say, Gaddafi, and he ostensibly adhered to democratic values. The original Gambian state was not single-party, nor was it authoritarian, and the media was even quite free. This was, in fact, all too good to be true, which is why Jawara was the victim of several coup attempts, including one in which foreign armies had to intervene to save him, and was eventually deposed by a military coup in 1994. Number 9. The Comoros. The Comoros may be an island nation that almost nobody's ever heard of, but so far, that hasn't stopped it from breaking a number of rather impressive records. The archipelago is one of the most revolution-prone countries in Africa and indeed the world, with a grand total of 21 throughout its history, a fact that's even more impressive when you consider that it's only actually existed for 42 years. Problems started from the very outset of independence, when it turned out that one of the islands claimed by the Comoros didn't actually want to join up with them and preferred being ruled by France instead. Since then, the Comoros has experienced a number of rather unique events, such as a Maoist revolution, a president shot dead in his bed by an anti-tank missile, and dictatorship backed by foreign mercenaries. Number 8. Mali. Mali is a beautiful and idyllic African country, filled to the brim with natural resources and fragmented along religious and ethnic lines. If there ever was a prime candidate to become a failed state, it would be Mali. It is no surprise then, perhaps, that half a century on from independence, this nation has not been as successful as some had hoped. Mali's first post-independence leader, Modibo Keïta, was a socialist who wanted to nationalize the country's resources, the majority of which were still owned by the French colonial masters, and reduce rampant inequality. However, this dream was too good to be true, and he was deposed and imprisoned in 1968 in a military coup. Keïta's replacement, a general named Moussa Traoré, initially had the support of quite a few people in Mali, but his regime soon proved to be far worse than that of his predecessor. Mali became an authoritarian police state, and the sad combination of famines, corruption, and mismanagement of aid money led to the death of tens of thousands. Reform eventually prevailed, however, and a democratic system was implemented, which resulted in Traoré winning 99% of the vote. Number 7. Brunei. Brunei is known by some as the Shellfare State, and with good reason. This small, petroleum-rich Asian nation has been effectively bankrolled by the oil companies that operate within it. Brunei's authoritarian leader, Sultan Bolkiah, was once one of the world's richest men, but this wealth hasn't come at the expense of his people, or at least, not too much. Bruneian citizens receive subsidies on everything from petrol to oil, and despite the fact that the Sultan spends millions of the public budget on his collection of luxury cars, Brunei has one of the highest GDPs per capita in the world. One might assume then, that Brunei is about as close to a perfect country to live in as you can get. With riches galore, palm-fringed beaches, and beautiful jungles covering the entire country, it would be fair at first glance to make that guess. However, Brunei's unique situation also brings with it some rather unique problems. For example, the country is both one of the most obese in the region and one of the most repressive, as the vast network of generous subsidies and grants has effectively allowed the Sultan to buy out the Bruneians' right to freedom. Number 6. Central African Republic. The Central African Republic's name is a bit of a misnomer. It is central, and it is indeed African, but the CAR at the moment is less of a republic and more of a failed state. As with Somalia, the government controls little of the country outside of the capital, and much of the nation is run by various rebel groups. The CAR has also, much like Somalia, been in a state of quasi-perpetual civil war for over a decade. The country's problems, though, date back quite a bit further than the start of civil war. The first democratic leader of the CAR only lasted a few years before dying in a suspicious plane crash. From then on, the country spiraled into madness, first with the establishment of a one-party state and then with the overthrow of President David Dacko and the establishment of a Central African empire. If anything could be worse than the old single-party state, it was this a belief proven correct when the new Emperor Bokassa spent a third of the government budget on his coronation ceremony, completely bankrupting the country. Number 5. East Timor. East Timor is one of the world's most decidedly unlucky countries. First exploited and colonized by Portugal, the islanders fought valiantly for their independence and were finally granted it in 1975 after the Portuguese Revolution. It was very much a case of jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire, though, for as soon as independence was declared, neighboring Indonesia took advantage of the internal strife and disorder within the new country to invade it and declare it part of their own territory. One might assume that the invasion of a former colony might not be taken particularly kindly by the West, especially when said colony was right off the coast of Australia, one of the region's most important powers. And said occupation led to massive human rights abuses and the killing of what some estimate to be up to a third of the East Timorese population. Number 4. Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea is a unique country in many ways. It is, for example, the only Spanish-speaking nation in Africa, as a former colony of Spain. It is also the only state on the continent to have a capital not on its mainland but rather on a tiny island several hundred miles offshore. No, really. Somewhat less adorably, it also has the longest-serving leader in Africa, Teodoro Obiang, the epitome of a despotic strongman, whose rule has lasted almost 40 years. The country's crazy history started as soon as it gained independence. After its break with Spain, the new leader, Messias Nguema, turned the country into a single-party state and made himself president for life, perhaps foreshadowing what was to come. Nguema was quick to establish relationships with the world's communist countries despite denouncing Marxism as neo-colonialism in Africa. Regardless of his self-declared moral high ground, he had no issue with murdering or sending into exile a third of the country's population in one of the most horrific genocides in modern history. Number 3. Guinea-Bissau. If one thing can be said about former Portuguese colonies, it's that they have a rather worrying tendency to fall into the clutches of civil war. Guinea-Bissau is no exception to this rule. Following in the footsteps of Angola, Mozambique, and East Timor, this Lusophone nation has also been ravaged by conflict. There is one difference, though, between Guinea-Bissau and the others: the country's most stable years were paradoxically those immediately after independence. It was also unique in that it managed to obtain independence before being given it peacefully by Portugal. Helped by large quantities of arms from communist countries, the Marxist nationalist movement gained control of the country through a guerrilla war and broke away from Lisbon in 1973, a year before being recognized by the new Portuguese government. They ruled as a single-party state for a decade before finally making the transition to democracy and allowing multipartisan elections, which is, ironically, when the country started to collapse. Number 2. Turkmenistan. For a country whose closest living relative is probably North Korea, it is surprising how few people have heard of Turkmenistan. While it may be a crazy nation, it hasn't always been this way. Unlike some of the countries on this list, Turkmenistan's history is ancient and goes back over 1,000 years, yet the 20-odd years since independence from the Soviet Union have probably been more eventful than all of the rest put together. Under Soviet rule, Turkmenistan was very much the quintessential Central Asian republic, underfunded, exploited, and oppressed by the government in Moscow and mainly left out from the liberalization and development that happened during the USSR's later years. After the Great Split in 1991, though, Turkmenistan chose to follow quite a different path from its brethren. Number 1. Paraguay. If there was ever to be an all-important rule for leading a country, it would be to not declare war on countries 20 times the size of yours. Leaders who fall foul of this generally end up in a pretty bad state, and one of these was Paraguay's dictator, Francisco Solano López. At the time, Paraguay hadn't been a country for very long, but López seemed determined to end its existence before it even started by declaring war on Uruguay, Argentina, and, incredibly, Brazil in 1864. As one might expect, this didn't go too well, and only half a century after independence, two-thirds of the population, by some estimates, had already been wiped out. The country, perhaps predictably, continued to be somewhat unstable, chewing up and spitting out a grand total of 31 leaders throughout the first half of the 20th century, most removed by a coup. It also started another war to reclaim the territory it had lost during the first one, only this time, it picked on a slightly easier opponent in the form of Bolivia, so Paraguay actually won. The country's political instability ended, however, after a coup following the country's civil war, from which strongman Alfredo Stroessner emerged as leader. With that being said, here we come to the end of our video. I hope you like it. So don't forget to hit the bell icon and to subscribe our channel. See you in the next video. Till then, take care. Thank you.